On the 22nd of February this year, the UCPI, the Undercover Policing Inquiry, successfully concluded Tranche One of 5 of the inquiry, and that Tranche One covered the period 1968 to 1982. The chair of the inquiry, Sir John Mitting, has set a target to finalise and complete the full investigations by 2026. And so far, there's been a lot of disclosure as well as live testimony from non-state core participants, some of whom we will hear tonight, actually, undercover officers as well, and police managers. And so far, what has begun to be exposed is the colossal scale and scandal of an unprecedented scale of political policing, some of which it looks like has been endorsed by the highest levels of government. And the infliction of betrayal, injustice and deceit on those who were targeted by these undercover officers is becoming increasingly clear and in plain sight. On the 29th of June this year, the chair of the inquiry released an interim report. I presume a lot of people on this call may have seen this. And it was based on the findings from Tranche One. And this evening, what we're going to do is reflect on what was included in that interim report by the chair, and arguably what was omitted. So we're going to look at the positives, the negatives, what was omitted from these interim findings. And what we'd like to do as well is to kind of primarily discuss the report that we're releasing today. And there will be a link in the chat with our report. It's a free report. To discuss the collection of work that PILC and the legal team, PILC's legal team, have done in the UCPI so far in their opening and closing statements. And the legal team, to give a shout out to those that deserve it, is James Scobie KC from Garden Court Chambers, Piers Marquis from Doughty Street Chambers, and we're going to be hearing from Piers shortly, and my colleague Paul Heron, who is the PILC Legal Director and Senior Solicitor at our law centre. To prepare the submissions, this legal team have read thousands of disclosed documents, and many of those documents are actually now available on the Undercover Policing Inquiry website. We will also put a link in the chat to that for those that haven't seen it before, because it's a really useful resource. And so we hope that we're well placed to host this meeting and comment on the chair's interim report. Altogether, Public Interest Law Centre represent 11 core participants at the UCPI, and 3 of those are in Tranche One. That is Lindsey, who we're going to hear from later, a former leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party and a founder of the Stop the War Coalition. Mary, who is a member of the International Marxist Group and a supporter of workers' rights, and she was unfortunately deceived into a sexual relationship with an undercover officer. And Richard Chesham, who was an activist in the group, the Troops Out movement. We wanted to take a minute and say very clearly that we applaud all the core participants that have involvement in the UCPI for their years of political campaigning, and also for their integrity throughout this process thus far. And of course, we want to applaud the work that's been done by the legal team as well, who have worked on this very diligently. Just to give you a bit of a rundown of who we're going to hear from tonight. We're going to hear from Piers, as I've said earlier, who is part of the legal team, who's going to give us an overview of Tranche One and some of the key findings. So he's going to talk about the chair's interim report, and he's also going to talk about what his legal team has found in Tranche One and pull out some of the parts that are included in PILC's report that we're releasing today. And then we're going to have reflections from 3 core participants of the UCPI, who I'm going to fully introduce later just before they speak. But they are Donna, McLean, Suresh Grover and Lindsey, and we're really honoured to be joined by them tonight. And finally, we would love to have a discussion. We would love for everyone that's come to the meeting tonight to have the opportunity to ask questions or to make a comment. So we will make space for that later on. So yeah, please note down any questions. Also, you can pop questions in the chat throughout the meeting, and we'll pick up on them at the end. So, you know, we do want you to be involved. We do want to hear from you. Okay, moving on. Before we hear the speakers, we wanted to share a short video clip to give us a bit of perspective on what led to the inquiry for those that don't know. So just bear with me for one moment while I do some fun tech, and we will play that video.
Back in 1993, Lois Austin led a protest against the far-right British National Party. As head of Youth Against Racism, she wanted an end to racist attacks in London. Theirs was a peaceful group, but police decided to infiltrate them.
I found out in 2010 that I had been spied on by Peter Francis for about 4 or 5 years. Peter Francis was the chief whistleblower. So he was an undercover police officer working for the SDS for many years.
The SDS, or Special Demonstration Squad, was set up in 1968 when a wave of protests against the Vietnam War caught the police by surprise. Deciding intelligence was needed to control future demonstrators, an elite and highly secret squad within the Metropolitan Police was created. Over more than 4 decades, at least 139 police officers were given fake identities to closely monitor more than 1,000 political groups.
Pretty much anybody that posed any form of challenge to kind of state or corporate interests. Everything from environmental campaigners, opponents of the arms trade, animal rights activists, anti-racist campaigners.
To gain access to these groups, some officers started intimate relationships with female members. Then after a few years, when their deployment was over, they disappeared from their lives.
That threw my life completely into disarray, because as you can imagine, if you've spent 2 years with somebody and you think you know them really well, and then you discover that actually you know, they were spying on you, or they didn't exist. You know, he's a person who no longer exists. I didn't know even his name. The implications that has for all your other relationships, it destroys your ability to trust.
Okay, you'll be happy to know that we are moving on to our fabulous speakers. So, to introduce our first speaker, Piers. So Piers Marquis specialises in criminal work with a political and public inquiry dimension. And he has a particular emphasis on freedom of expression and the right to protest. He's defended many prominent activists and is instructed by Public Interest Law Centre in the UCPI. His clients include members of the Troops Out movement, Youth Against Racism in Europe, CND, Stop the War Coalition, former leading members of the SWP, Socialist Worker Party, and a former Labour Member of Parliament. So, Piers, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Saskia. I'm actually going to give a fairly brief overview of the inquiry's key findings in the interim report, and hopefully an idea of where the inquiry really should be going next. It's worth emphasising again that this is an interim report. It only deals with the evidence from the Tranche One period between 68 and 82. We have 3 more years of hearings to come and a lot of evidence to be heard in that time. So as an interim report, this is not comprehensive. It does not claim to be comprehensive. And there are plainly a number of areas that it doesn't cover. Some of those areas have been specifically emphasised by the inquiry as areas with conclusions that have been reserved until after all of the evidence has been given. The 3 main ones of those are the purpose of gathering intelligence on justice campaigns, like the Blair Peach campaign, the Stephen Lawrence campaign, and others. The impact on the relatives of the dead children whose identities were taken by these officers. And of course, the impact on the many women who were deceived into sexual relationships. So we know that there are conclusions to follow on those in 3 years' time. There are also a number of other outstanding issues that haven't been specifically referred to in the report, but they follow on from the main interim conclusion. and I'll deal with those towards the end of my short 15 minutes that I have. Before I move on to the main interim conclusion, there are some passing points on the sexual relationships issue. 2 of the abused women did give evidence in Tranche One, and the report concluded that both of their accounts were truthful. Frankly, there couldn't have been any other conclusion. Mary's account, supported with detail from Richard Chesham, and Madeline's brave and absolutely compelling live evidence. Both accounts were completely unquestionable. So the truthfulness of the women's accounts shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. It's the detail of the report's finding on the specific sexual relationships that flags 2 areas of potential concern. The first is that there is a notable reluctance to find dishonesty on the part of police officers. The second is that the report found that neither of these 2 sexual relationships were used to gain advancement, i.e. tactical advancement, and that includes no finding on the most basic level of tactical advancement, which was whether relationships were used by officers to cement officer identities and build their legends. So on both of those positions in the report, there was a lot of evidence to the contrary, and it will be interesting to see how far those positions are sustained in the next tranches. So I'm flagging those areas at the moment without commenting further on them for now. So moving on to the main interim report conclusion. The focus of the publicity, quite rightly, was the major conclusion. The long-term undercover deployments into the private and political lives of thousands of left-wing activists was not justified. It was not justified on either of the grounds that were put forward: A, the policing of public order, or B, counter-subversion. And as a result, the STS should have been shut down. Now, in respect of public order, the SDS was established and funded by the Home Office with the stated aim of policing large-scale public order risks, such as the Grosvenor Square disturbances in 1968. So the Met Police position was to try to justify the SDS by saying that the unit played a huge part in preventing public disorder. Now, that position was challenged across the board by the non-state core participants. And the inquiry found that the undercover unit's contribution to policing public order, quotes, should not be overstated. Now, in respect of the most significant incidents of public order in Tranche One, the contribution made by the SDS and their intelligence was limited. The 2 main examples were the Battle of Lewisham in August 1977. The report concluded that SDS reporting had some tactical value, but basically confirmed what was already obvious. And it was obvious. If a street violent fascist organisation like the National Front are going to launch a deliberately provocative racist march against the stated wishes of the local community, you don't need an embedded officer to tell you what the public order issue is going to be. In respect of Southall, in April 79, another example of deliberate fascist provocation, when Blair Peachy was, of course, killed by the police, the SDS contribution was found to be of minimal value. Now, this conclusion in respect of public order policing was clear on the face of the evidence. The report included an evidential snapshot from 1975 to 1978. there were 2,600 SDS reports examined by the inquiry. 1,400 of those reports dealt with personal details of people's lives. 1,200 dealt with meetings and activities of organisations, i.e. political organisation. Now, only 200 of those reports contained information that might have had an impact on public order policing, and that's less than 8%. I stress the word might because it's not suggested that 8% did have an impact on policing. The 8% simply made a reference to public order. So evidentially, the position on that was overwhelming. The ends clearly did not justify the means. Subversion, the secondary position on justification was that the SDS assisted the security services in counter-subversion work, intelligence gathering primarily. The police position was that gathering personal information was a byproduct of the unit's public order work. That position became unsustainable as soon as the scale of that reporting became apparent, and it really was apparent on the evidence. The clear focus of the SDS reporting was on the personal lives and the political views of its targets. Short break. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the various definitions of subversion and the machinations in relation to special branch taskings that went on behind the scenes in the Home Office, the Cabinet Office and the Security Service. It's quite complicated. I don't have the time for it here today, but there's a thorough analysis of that in the report, particularly in the submissions in the opening of phase 2 and phase 3. But the key conclusions in the report were that 1, the SDS tasking on monitoring potential subversives was questionable. And 2, of the hundreds of groups infiltrated, only 3 met the criteria of constituting an actual threat to the safety or well-being of the state. Now, it follows from that not a single one of the non-state core participants met the criteria, not one. So, in the absence of justification, the report went on to consider 4 key features that should have led to the SDS being shut down. First of all, it was inevitable that long-term deployments would involve, at the very least, befriending individuals and the subsequent intrusion into their private and political lives. And that required cogent justification before being even contemplated as a police tactic. Secondly, most deployments would require entry into people's homes by deceit. Thirdly, that officers taking positions of responsibility in organisations, which they regularly did, would inevitably involve A, gathering data that was protected by the law relating to confidential information, and B, it would also inevitably involve, particularly when you take a high position in an organisation, it would inevitably involve the organisation of political activity on the part of an undercover officer. Fourthly, the use of dead children's identities would inevitably have given rise to legitimate public concern, and that those responsible for the unit were well aware of that risk. They were aware of the risk of the practice becoming public from as early as 1975. So those 4 key points were picked out in the report, and the wording of the report needs some close analysis. So I'm going to quote directly for these 3 lines. They come from the report at page 95. It's paragraph 25 to 27 of the conclusions. Firstly, None of these issues, these 4 issues that I've just been through, none of these issues appears to have been addressed by senior officers within the MPS or by Home Office officials during the period. 2, they should have been addressed at the highest level within the MPS and within the Home Office. 3, if these issues had been addressed, it is hard to see how any conclusion could legitimately have been reached which would not have resulted in the closure of the SDS. So the conclusion is welcome, and the SDS should have been closed down in the very early stages. But that cannot be anything other than a partial conclusion. It's a building block conclusion, really. It provides the foundation for the next steps. Because the conclusion, it should have been shut down, really begs the ultimate question then, which is, well, why wasn't it? And it might well be right to say that senior officers, that the Home Office, I'd add the security services, it might be right to say that they did not address these issues in the sense that they took no positive action to deal with them. But there's a danger in misinterpreting this word address and assuming that they didn't know about these 4 issues. But that's not the conclusion, and it couldn't have been the conclusion because the evidence is overwhelming that they did know about those 4 issues. At the very least, senior Met officers and the security services knew. The Rick Gibson, real name Rick Clark, deployment, one of the undercover officers who went into the Troops Out movement. This was in 1974 and 1975. That deployment was a watershed moment on all of these 4 points. So in a nutshell, there's a lot more detail in the report, but in a nutshell, the police reports from Gibson are clear. Deployed into a university, keeping the company of young single women like Mary, supplying personal detail that could only have been obtained from spending time with them in their homes. Police reports detailing the false relationship with Richard Chesham and the time that was spent in his home. Clark being confronted with proof that he had taken the identity of a deceased child, confronted by activists, that is. And reports that dealt with his rise through the Troops Out movement, right to the top of the movement, as convener of the National Secretariat. He undertook actions in that position, which were inevitably destabilising. And all of this was well documented. Unusually in Gibson's case, both the Met Police and MI5 retained copies of these documents. It's worth noting as well that the inquiry's report specifies the high positions that 2 officers took in the Socialist Workers' Party Right to Work campaign. But let's not forget, the security services actually tasked the Met Police to put officers into the SWP HQ. So all of this was known about at the highest level. The paper trail that we've seen goes right up the Met hierarchy and into MI5. Both were then party to interdepartmental meetings on counter-subversion, that included the Cabinet Office and the Home Office. So it is obviously not a complete conclusion to say that these issues should have been addressed, but were not. That conclusion has to be a building block for the fundamental systemic questions that need to follow in the next tranches. Why was this not addressed? Why was the SDS not shut down? How far up the chain of government did this systemic failure go? Why was the SDS allowed to continue and fully funded for another 35 years? Why did the focus continue to be on left-wing organisations throughout that time period? Why was there such a focus on the employment details and the trade union affiliations of left-wing individuals? To what extent was the SDS reporting used in blacklisting? What was the full client base of the SDS reporting? The officers, the management from the SDS refer to customers. Well, these customers that were the recipients of confidential data on our clients, who were they? Who were all of them? What was the basis on which they received this confidential data? Now, bearing in mind that the ends did not justify the means from a public order or a subversion perspective, what was the purpose of the SDS continuing? So all of those questions really have to be asked now, and they have to form the subject matter of the final report. They're key. I'm going to end with a last point, because there was another conclusion in the interim report. It was this: there is limited evidence to suggest that the SDS was a tool to suppress the aspirations of those who wished to produce radical change by political means. Now, limited evidence to suggest, in effect, that this was political policing. Well, that is a much more questionable conclusion than many of the others. But in fairness to the inquiry, it was more informal. It can be found at the end of the foreword to the report rather than in the body of the report itself. But the questions that I've highlighted, when those questions that really do have to be asked when you take the current building block conclusion, when they are asked, there will be a strong case for revisiting the conclusion in respect of political policing.
Thank you very much, Piers, for that overview, which I think for myself anyway demonstrates how much information is involved here, how much digging has already been done and the time it takes to read through all that disclosure, analyse everything, and then start to get a understanding of the scale of what's going on here. And I'll speak for myself in learning, how high up this political policing was reaching to the highest levels of government. Is really shocking, and it still shows that we've got a lot to learn. So thank you very much, Piers. And as I said, I know you're not able to be here for the discussion, but we really appreciate the time that you've given us today. Okay.
Thank you.
No worries at all. We have 3 other amazing speakers. We think it's really important to hear from the core participants of the UCPI, and we're really happy that we're joined by 3 of them tonight. And we're going to hear about why they're core participants in the inquiry, what their experiences has been, and any reflections that they want to give us when we're at this in-between point of this inquiry. So the next speaker is Donna McLean, who is a social justice activist and a writer, and she's written for The Guardian, The Press and Journal, and various other publications. She is a core participant at the UCPI, as I've said. She's also author of Small Town Girl, Love Lies and the Undercover Police. And in the book, she tells the true story of the relationship she was deceived into by Carlo Neri, an undercover cop from the SDS, the Special Demonstration Squad. Donna, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Saskia. Really lovely to be here. So I suppose I'll just introduce myself and explain why I'm here. So in 2002, I was working in South London in drug treatment. I originally was a mental health nurse, and I moved to London when I was in my early 20s. And when I was 30, I met someone called Carlo on anti-war demonstration. It was the very first big march in September 2002, and Carlo was there with several friends of mine, so someone that I knew very well from work and other friends that I'd met socially. And Carlo, as far as I knew, was a locksmith. He was very much involved in left-wing politics, and he'd moved back to London from Italy, where he'd moved to when he was 15. So he came from an Anglo-Italian family. He was working class, incredibly political, very charming. And we got together very quickly. So we met September 2002, and within 6 weeks, he'd moved in with me. So I'd recently come out of a very long-term relationship, a 12-year relationship. And Carlo, as far as I was aware, was single at that time. We did get together quickly, and we had a conversation. We had a conversation that he brought up about monogamy, and he asked me my views because he said he felt really strongly about it. And things progressed. We were incredibly happy together. We had a real blend of social circles. So he got to meet my family. He came to Scotland several times. He went on holiday with my family. He stayed in their houses. And even, he was so embedded in my life that he looked after the youngest member of our family, who was 3 at the time, while we chose a headstone for my granny's grave because she died just after I met Carlo. He went to my sister's graduation in Glasgow. And as far as I was concerned, he was going to be my life partner. We talked about getting married. We talked about having children. And everything was going pretty well. Now, he'd told me he had a child quite soon into the relationship. So before he moved in, he told me that he had a child he was estranged from, that he'd had a very brief relationship. And he had a child who was 3 years old. And that's why he found it very easy to look after our little niece. So that was fine. He'd had this relationship with a journalist. And so he started to rebuild that relationship. And he told me that was incredibly important to him. He wanted to have that relationship with his child, and it was part of our future together, that this was going to be part of our integrated family plan. We carried on. Things were great. In terms of politics, my background, as I said, I'd been a nurse, and then I was working in drug and alcohol treatment at the time. I was a very active trade union member. I'd been a trade union rep in the workplace. I came from a very left-wing family. My dad was a full-time union rep. But I suppose most of my focus was on my work, very much involved in the social justice aspects of working with people who were very much denied services. And that took up a lot of my time and energy. We spent a lot of time socially with other activists, and a lot of the people that we were friends with were people who were involved in the building industry, but also teachers, lawyers, nurses, the whole kind of very public sector. And it was a lovely crowd of people. So time went on, and I hadn't met Carlo's family in Italy, but he had taken me to Bologna, and we'd gone, but told me that I couldn't meet his dad, who was still over there, because his dad was very ill, plus there was a fractured relationship. He also had a sister in England, who he spoke to regularly on the phone. But again, whenever I was going to meet his sister, there was an issue. And he said that she'd had quite a lot of problems with mental health, and she had relationship problems. But there was always a kind of a long-term plan that I would meet his family. And as I say, he would speak to people on the phone when I was there. So it all seemed very straightforward. Nothing seemed particularly suspicious until probably about a year into the relationship. So we got engaged 3 months after we met. He'd moved in 6 weeks after we met, but about a year into the relationship, things changed a bit. And he was going away much more. He changed his job. He started to do some work abroad. So he'd gone from being a locksmith to working for an Italian food company, and he travelled back and forwards, and then he was rebuilding his relationship with his child. So during the course of that, he probably spent about 4 days a fortnight away, and the rest of the time he was with me in my flat. And as far as I was concerned, we were still planning to get married, still planning to kind of, have a future together. And then his father got very sick. Carlo went back and then rang me to say that his father had died. So he spent a couple of weeks in Italy. He didn't want me to go with him. He seemed incredibly stressed, but that was, that was obvious. Things were difficult. The family relationship was difficult. But when he came back, things had changed completely. So he had 2 weeks away, came back after the funeral, and then he changed physically. It was kind of strange. Thinking back now, he had actually changed the way he looked. So when he came back from Italy after that period when his father had died, he'd lost weight, he'd grown his hair out, he looked really scruffy, his beard was scruffy. And I always remember that there was this thing about his eyes looked different. He became physically very different, but also quite cold. And then he sort of hit me with this bombshell, which was that his sister, who'd been depressed, who I hadn't met, had disclosed that there had been sexual abuse when she was a child. Now, he'd previously said there was domestic abuse in the family, so I knew about this, and I knew that was part of the problem within the family and why things were so difficult. But this was an entirely new thing, and it was new to him. So he appeared to then have a breakdown, and he started to disappear. He'd go away for a week at a time, not answer his phone. He said he was suicidal. He was very angry, very upset. And he decided he would move out for a while. So he went to live with a friend, a mutual friend. And he still said, we're going to get back together. Everything's going to be fine. I just need this time to sort myself out. And we kept seeing each other. So this carried on for another almost a year, really. So in total, we were together for just over 2 years. But things never really came back together. And it was quite devastating because he told me to not tell anyone about the family stuff, about this issue with his sister, and obviously explained why things were so difficult for her, but they had so much to work through. So I was trying to kind of keep this to myself and support him and still go to work. And I was working full time in quite a stressful job. I got promoted to being a manager. So it was a really difficult time. And then he, the disappearing acts kept up. He moved on to live with another friend. And then finally, he ended the relationship by sending me an email to work. And I remember I got this, it was in November 2004, so just over 2 years since we got together. He sent me this email saying, it's over, I can't do this, I really can't cope, it's been too much, I'm so sorry. And that really was the end of it. The last time I saw him before that was awful. He put me in a cab and threw some money at me. And then that was the last I heard of him. So it kind of, it broke my heart, and it felt like it had ended in a really difficult way. It didn't feel like there was no fault on any part as far as I was concerned. He just couldn't deal with this huge traumatic thing that had happened. So it took me a couple of years to kind of sort myself out. There were various problems that had arisen for me because we were trying to get a flat together, and then that fell through, and I was in between places and all sorts. So I had a lot to contend with myself. But then finally, moved on, moved away, had children. Everything was kind of going well again. And out of the blue, I got this message telling me that people needed to talk to me about Carlo. So it was 10 years after I'd seen him that I got this message, 2015, basically saying, we know that Carlo is not who he said he was. He was an undercover police officer, which kind of partly blew my mind. But also I'd read Rob Evans and Paul Lewis's book by that point, Undercover. And these clues had just emerged from that book. And I thought, this sounds weirdly like how Carlo left me. But I couldn't understand because I couldn't see any reason why I would have been targeted or spied on. I wasn't majorly involved in politics. I was a sort of basically a small town girl, as the book says, small town girl who was a nurse, who was a trade union member, which was perfectly normal as far as I was concerned, and had no clue as to why the state would be interested in me or my life. But as it emerged, the people who had been doing this work, so activists and journalists together, had put together a lot of pieces of a jigsaw that proved categorically that Carlo was, in fact, an undercover police officer, that Carlo Neri was his cover name. His real name was Carlo Suresh. And the whole time he was with me, he was married, had one child, and his wife was pregnant with another child while we were engaged and living together. So obviously that was a hugely mind-blowing story to have to try and reconcile with the life that I had and how I had been living and what had happened afterwards. And I think, you know, the fact that he created this entire story of trauma, the stories about his family, that really sort of, it all felt very disjointed, because this entire narrative of why this relationship had happened and then broken down was totally untrue. So I very quickly became a core participant, moved into that role, spent 5 years undercover myself with a name, a pseudonym, which was Andrea at the time. And then I finally dropped that name and reclaimed my own, which I felt was quite important, because I felt a huge burden from living a double life. And I felt this had been put on me by Carlo and by the state. And it felt that I shouldn't have to hide or change my name, and that I should be able to speak and write and talk and just be myself and kind of show the world that in some ways, you know, this idea that people were being targeted because they were subversive, or they were being targeted because they were dangerous, was completely untrue. You know, no one that I know was involved in anything other than trying to make the world a better place. That was what we did. And even had people been involved in anything that was illegal or criminal, there was no justification whatsoever for the level of intrusion on all of our lives. You know, to live with someone for 2 years and be involved in an intimate relationship and embed yourself in every part of someone's life for no reason. And I think, as Piers has said, you know, the report has found that. Absolutely, there was no justification. And I guess that, you know, the thing that really strikes you is that it was clear from the 1970s that the SDS should have been shut down at that point. None of us should be in the situation we're in. So I'm in Tranche 2, which means I should give evidence next year at the end of 2024. But none of it should have happened. And of all the women who've had relationships, who were deceived into relationships, none of us should have been in that situation. The fact is that for many women, you know, a huge chunk of their lives were taken. And it wasn't, you know, it was about their bodily autonomy and also their fertility. I had children much later than I planned to, partly because my 30s were stolen by Carlo and the state. But I think one thing I really kind of wanted to say is that the relationships have been put aside in terms of any critical analysis. So the report doesn't tell us too much. What we know is they were absolutely categorically wrong. But the huge question mark is, how much did people know, and where did that information and knowledge go to? The idea that there are customers who have our files when I've never seen my file, so I don't really know why I was targeted. You know, there's something very, very sinister that you can have a very ordinary life and be involved in a relationship, and MI5 have got a file on you and you've no idea why. That's just insane. But I suppose for me, the most critical thing is to note that even though we're seeing evidence of people who had relationships and they are being believed, there's still no acknowledgement that it was systemic. There's no acknowledgement that management knew about it right to the very, very top. And also, we don't have our files. We've got no disclosure. There's absolutely no disclosure. And I think also the fact that the chair has taken a very sympathetic attitude, Mitting has taken a very sympathetic attitude towards the police officers when they've given evidence, and his attitude towards the non-state core participants has not been sympathetic. It's been accusatory, it's been suspicious. And believing in the honesty of the police force is just incredible, given what we know now. We know that you know, that unit should have been shut down. In fact, not only was it not shut down, they went on to create a whole other one called the NPOIU, which came after the SDS. And the absolute volume of relationships is just astonishing. Sorry, you want to shut me up now?
No, that's all right. Donna, thank you so much. I'm just aware of time to have discussion at the end, but I wanted to say that was amazing, and we really appreciate you coming on and telling your story, because, you know, we know that must take energy to have, you know, to do that all the time, and we really appreciate it. And we really appreciate some of the things you've just said as well about the fact that you haven't had your file disclosed, and that's a massive issue, and actually how the chair in the inquiry has been treating undercover coppers or the police compared to core participants has been really interesting. it'll be really good to circle back on that in the discussion as well. So thank you very, very much.
Sorry, I've not spoken.
Not at all. Not at all. I would listen to you all day, but we're on a tight schedule here, So I'm going to move ahead now, folks. We've had two fantastic speakers. We have another speaker for you now. That speaker is Suresh Grover, who's one of the active leaders of the youth movement established during the aftermath of the Gurdeep Singh Shagar murder in Southall in 1979. The incident galvanised Asian youth to challenge violent racism and police response throughout the UK. After the murder of Blair Peach by police at an anti-Nazi march in 1979, the Southall Monitoring Group, now called the Monitoring Group, was launched with Suresh as one of the founders. The Southall Monitoring Group played a crucial role in advocating for justice on behalf of several families, including those of Kuldeep Sekon, who tragically lost his life in 1989, Stephen Lawrence, whose life was cut short in 1993, Ricky Reel, who met a similar fate in 1997, and Michael Menson, who also lost his life that same year. In response to the McPherson report, the group expanded its reach, forming a national network and adopting the name the Monitoring Group. I'm very excited about Suresh speaking today because I've heard a lot about him in other meetings and other campaigns. It's very exciting. Suresh is also a core participant at the Spycops inquiry, and actually Public Interest Law Centre have worked with Suresh on other cases, including a judicial review regarding stopping the sale of Southall Town Hall, which was a community asset. So Suresh is a busy person and we're very happy that he's with us today. Suresh, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the privilege to speak to people on this such an important, crucial issue. Thankfully, Piers has, as others have said, given a synthesis of the factual conclusions or interim report findings that have been published in June by the inquiry. Let me just tell you a bit why we are part of the inquiry. And I have to say that in 2014-15, we persuaded a lot of people, Justice Family Campaigns, to really start looking at being co-participants in it. But we always were very clear that we had to go in with our eyes wide open. And I think I just want to say that that cautious approach, that approach of not totally telling with how the state responds to our concerns and our resistance and our challenges against authoritarianism or racism is justified. And let me tell you why I say that. So the report is not a complete picture of the events that folded from 1968 to 1981, the period that the first tranche is examining. And the reason for that is there are structural problems in the remit and how the inquiry has been established. There are conceptual problems that have been forced down our throat by the state, by MITing especially as the chair, and by police narrative about what spying and policing are. And the first one is that they all, regardless of the dangers of spying and its undemocratic usage, horrendous use of targeting women and having relationships with them, blacklisting trade unions, spying on peaceful protest groups, etc., etc. They paint a picture that the police are still neutral. And actually, our experience shows that spying is just another form of coercion and policing that exists on a day-to-day basis. We don't see it any different from police brutality or institutional racism. It's part and parcel. And let me give you very concrete examples of why I say that. For example, this anomaly that exists between examining only what the STS officers, or the focus on STS officers into spying into protest groups, rather than the connection between them and the special branch, and the information that is being driven by special branch and managed by special branch, filtered to the STS and their working relationship. So if you look at the period from 68 to 1982, most of the political actions taken by Black activists, and by that being Black, brown activists, anti-racists, are not being examined in this inquiries thus far. We're in a very strange situation because the monitoring group was established as Southern Monitoring Group in 1979-80. And we exist still, unlike many other groups. So the spying of us starts around 1979, 1980, and actually still exists at the moment in our view, although it may have ended in 2008. And we don't know which tranche we are going to be actually asked to give evidence. And we've been seeking that answer from the chair for the last year. So, for example, the killing of Gurdeep Singh Chaggar in 1976, the establishment of youth movements, public order offenses, we are uprising, the police are arresting us, and there's development of youth movements. 79 is not just about the death of Blake Beach, crucial and critical as it is, and we've been campaigning with Syria for the last 40 odd years to hold someone to account. But the political process that took place that enabled that 40 fascists to be brought into Southall by police officers, escorted from outside Southall on St. George's Day, the arrest of 800 people in a span of 5.5 hours, the charging of 345 people and taken to Barnard Magistrates Court. You know who we are tried with? They are magistrates brought from Northern Ireland's Diplock juryless courts. And 90% conviction. And then the buildings that are established by project workers, including People's Unite, Misty and Roots, are demolished a month later, and the people, the local leaders, Beatrice Howe, the Tory Conservative leader, which allowed the incidents to go on and allowed the National Front to have that meeting, is given an OBE for community relations. This is a political process that took place. The killing of Blair Peach and the injuring of hundreds and thousands of people is absolutely important to examine. But I'll tell you why there was such police brutality on that day. They were afraid of an alliance being built between the Indian Workers Association, the Southall Youth Movement, the Women's Organization, the Anti-Nazi League, which galvanized and produced a massive counter-demonstration against the National Front, who were holding provocative meetings because of the election that just later saw the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 throughout different cities. Provocative meetings. And there were representations made to Merlin Rees, who was then the Home Secretary. So people were aware of its political ramifications and consequences. So for us to be told that's not a legitimate issue that needs to be discussed and we were not monitored by STS officers or special branch officers, when we know there's information. For example, we know when Malcolm X comes into Britain and Martin Luther comes to Britain in 1965 and onwards, called by the Indian Workers Association Birmingham, they have special branch officers at meetings who report, etc. We know, for example, and there are documents available recently, that just during the civil rights movement in America and the uprisings that were taking place, the British authorities were afraid the likelihood of riots taking place in this country. And they had a meeting out in a vessel, in a steamship outside Barbados to discuss how to contain it. There are documents available of it. And we know from Scarman's inquiry, after the 81 incidents, because of policing, Swamp 81, Brixton, and flare-up in other cities, Scarman himself says if we do not deal with discrimination, there are likely to be riots. What do? They increase police powers. They don't actually deal with discrimination. So the state, there is strong evidence, both in terms of policy and state, of the political decisions made by politicians and then bringing in police officers specifically who are going to create an authoritarian nature of policing and the state. So in 81, as a response to the 81 events, what do? Thatcher brings in Sir Kenneth Newman from Northern Ireland, who is the chief of Royal Ulster Constabulary. And what does he do? He creates sterile areas in so-called black communities, All Saints Road, Tottenham, Brixton, and changes in legislation under the Police 84 Act, where you create intimate body searches of women that is justified searches of Republican women in Ireland in the Green Bill. And also the creation of so-called sterile areas where there's mass so-called public disorder used against the miners' strike, the same legislation used against the miners' strike in 84. I think it's the complete picture from 65 to 81 is missing in this narrative. And we will obviously, when our time comes, we'll have to revisit the Blair Beach events and we'll have to visit the 65 events. And the reason why it's they're missing, and the reason why there's conceptual errors in how this thing has been framed is because the police narrative clearly is stating that family justice campaigns, Black communities are collateral intrusion. In other words, the real purpose of the spying are left-wing groups, and we come in the frame somehow. But actually, the history is, of course, there are alliances being built with here. The history is that we have our own history. We have our own rebellions. We have our own campaigns of resistance. And for us to be told that actually our struggles were not being monitored by SDS officers, but were by special branch officers, just does not tell the full picture. And so we have to deal with this notion of whatever they call collateral intrusion, and almost like collateral damage. And I think the other point that I want to make is that it's not surprising for me that although the conclusion is that the SDS in the interim, from the process and the period that they're examining, should have been disbanded. But they also say that there's no prejudice in the state for spying left-wing groups rather than, there's no real reason what the reason is on why they spy on left-wing groups rather than right-wing groups. Actually, the threat from the right-wing groups in the 1970s, electorally, violence, the link with fascist groups throughout Europe is a serious source of concern. And I think the reason for that is an examination of that fact will show that the state itself was consciously becoming authoritarian and actually moving towards the right, and actually against basic values of left-wing principles of solidarity, of empowerment of workers, of empowering minorities, of creating genuine communities that had value and poverty being dealt with. So there are serious critical political social issues that are just failing to be registered by Mitting. And his conclusion we can welcome for whatever reason, but we have to be doing it with our eyes very wide open. And I think the second thing I want to deal with is for Black justice campaigns. And there are 3 other campaigns that I'm involved in who are also co-participants. You've mentioned the Michael Manson case, Ricky Real case, another Stephen Lawrence case. Till today, despite its formation in 2015, and perhaps unlike other co-participants, we have very little disclosure. And the issue of disclosure is really serious. I know we've cross-examined some SDS officers, sometimes not revealing their identity. But the conclusions that we have come to, the inquiry has come to, actually is really through the effort of co-participants revealing all that information and their lawyers revealing that information through forensically examining and questioning what the police are saying. Nothing, really nothing of substantial has been given by the chair or the inquiry willingly. Been a hard-fought battle, but that is only a tenth of the information that we really should have. Most co-participants haven't got the disclosure that they're seeking for it. So when we were encouraging people in 2014 and 15 and people, we were thinking that at best, what we would be able to garner is the information that exists on us from the state, on how they were spying on us and why they were spying on us. And at the moment, even in Tranche One, although it not be relevant, the basic questions are still there to be answered. The disclosure is not full, and the reasons why we're being spied on haven't been really tested and commented by the inquiry itself, apart from saying they shouldn't exist. Well, why were we spied upon? How do we continue to be spied upon, etc.? Let me just raise another issue. There are useful disclosures on some of the stuff that we're involved in. We know, for example, in Blair Beach's case, his partner, Celia Stubbs, was not just being spied upon from the period that Blair Beach was killed, but had been spied on as a trade union leader or trade union activist for maybe 5-6 years before. We know that they were spying on Blair Beach's funeral, and they were spying on any commemorative events that were taking place on Blair Beach's case. 10 years, even 10 years later, in fact, they comment on a meeting that I chaired on the 10th anniversary of organizing a Blair Beach demonstration, but I haven't been given that disclosure. We know that they spied on GLC, which we had a relationship with, and they spied on people like the Racial Attacks Monitoring, which is us, because we're calling for genuine notions of accountability, of policing, etc., etc. But what it doesn't address, and this is a real battle that we have to have within MITing and within that frame, is it's not simply enough for MITing to say that the SDS officers should not exist. He needs to explain what their real purpose was and how far that consent, right up to the Prime Minister or Cabinet Office and the Home Secretary, and why those decisions were being made. Otherwise, we separate different arms of the state without understanding what the political nature of the spying was. And political policing by itself is a serious question for us. Within that remnants of political policing, there's the issue about institutional racism, misogyny, and anti-working class policing, which historically has been there since its establishment. So riots have always been spied upon by policing, from Northern Ireland in 1920s when the Royal Ulster Constabulary was established to the current period. I'm not happy with the conclusion that they believe that it's justified to spying on Sinn Féin. I'm not a member of Sinn Féin, but I think they need to explain why they say that. I don't think we should take it for granted. For me, Sinn Féin is a political organization. Even if it has relationship with the Irish Republican Army, still needs to explain that rather than put it out there and not explain it properly. I know Sinn Féin is not a co-participant, but those are important elements for us to understand to get a complete picture. And we don't have to be part of the Irish group to question the very nature of what that political policing is. The real purpose for us to be involved is really to galvanize a different kind of movement, because what they failed to do, despite spying on us, is fail our resolve. They haven't killed our resolve, they haven't killed our passion, and they haven't killed our belief in a just system that actually believes in solidarity between women and men, between working class and people who want to ensure that the system changes because of systemic problems of policing, etc. And all the information, all the different campaigns, all the revelations that are coming out on policing, etc., since the spying saga show clearly that things have worsened, not actually improved. So for MITing to come up with recommendations is going to be a real challenge, because we know recommendations cannot just be based on things shouldn't happen in this way. They have to be very clearly what the state would do to ensure what the penalties are of why people are being spied and who should not be spied on. I don't think we should accept this notion that anybody should be spied on. I think that's the premise that we should start from, and we should not let MITing and others in the next 2-3 years divide different co-participants on what their beliefs are. We'll have to justify, and I'm willing to do it politically, why we fought the skinheads in 1981 and burned down Hambro Tavern on self-defense basis. Prepared to justify why in Bradford 12 cases, people made petrol laws but never used them because they believed that the violence would be perpetrated on our communities. Those are central issues politically for us. And they actually lead to, and the reason why we've campaigned and the reason why we fought against racism is because we're not creating a different society based on prejudice or different levels of treatment of people. We actually believe in the complete development of human beings, as people who should value their lives as individuals and collectively. And actually, that's the most frightening thing about why I believe I'm so angry that I've been spied upon. That's actually what shocks me, because I think that itself is a threat to the state. And I want to know why. I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Suresh, for that. That was absolutely incredible. And it reminded me actually that we should always be aware that our starting point is as humans, and we should be angry about what's happened, and we shouldn't allow, for example, the chair of this inquiry to take the narrative of what's happening. And we should always question the starting point, which is, why should anyone be spied on? So I think it's really important to remember that. And also, as you said, we've got resolve, so we're still here and we're still fighting. Thank you very much. Before I invite our last speaker to speak, we are running a little bit over time, but I think for good reason. So in order for us to be able to have a bit of a discussion at the end and for anyone to ask questions, I'm going to propose that we continue the meeting if necessary to about 8:15. Of course, if anyone needs to leave, please leave. But yeah, it's been incredible so far, and we want to kind of keep this going. Before I introduce the last speaker as well, just a reminder that, you know, you can put questions in the chat throughout, and we'll come back to those after this speaker. So keep that in mind, because we do want to hear from you. All right, our last speaker, who's been very patient. So Lindsey German is a socialist campaigner from London. She's a founding member and a convener of the anti-war organisations Stop the War Coalition. She's also a founder of the socialist organisation called Counterfire. Lindsey gave live in-person evidence in Tranche One of the UCPI, which we are discussing this evening. And for over 30 years, she was the leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and in fact, the editor of their magazine, Socialist Review. And that organisation had around 35 undercover officers infiltrating the organisation over a 40-year period. So yeah, we're again really honoured to be joined by Lindsey. Lindsey, the floor is over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Saskia. And can I just say, first of all, thanks to all the legal team who've been so brilliant, certainly in terms of my case, and I'm sure in terms of the others, and also to pay tribute to the other participants, and particularly here, Donna, because I think, you know, whatever, I think I agree with Suresh that none of the spying is acceptable or justified. But I think the intrusion into people's personal lives and most intimate details in this way is absolutely horrific. And that's what we've found. And I just want to, I agree very much with so many of the points that people have made. So I'll just make a few points, I think, that hopefully we can discuss a little bit. Firstly, I became a socialist in the late 1960s when I was a teenager, and I
View button.
sorry, is this
Original sound from musicians calling up. Cited button.
Can you hear that as well?
Yeah.
That's really odd. Okay, I think it's stopped right now. You
Okay.
just keep going, and we'll try and deal with whatever it is.
Okay, lovely, thanks. No, what I was going to say is that I became a socialist when I was a teenager. I was influenced, as many of my generation were, opposition to the Vietnam War, opposition to apartheid in South Africa, support for the national liberation struggles. By the 70s, ideas of women's liberation, and I think it's very interesting that these Spycops focused so much on women and on spying on women, and obviously didn't support the ideas of liberation and feminism in any kind of sense. It was a period of hugely militant trade unionism where a whole number of strikes took place and were very, very successful. And it was also a period where people began to get increasingly alarmed about the threat of racism, about the threat of fascism, which was very, very real in the 1970s. I mean, it still is, but it's a very different situation now. And we had a situation, which Suresh has described some of it, where people were under attack all the time, that there were very large numbers of racist attacks and murders in London and in other cities. And the infiltration of these organizations and of people who campaigned like I did in the Anti-Nazi League was substantial. And when you think about it, it begins really the whole period, the formation of the group and the continuation of it coincides exactly with people becoming more militant, more concerned about things, more prepared, and in the case of the Black and Asian communities, more prepared to organise to stand up for themselves against the attacks that were coming from on a daily basis to them in many areas. And I think when you look at all that, you have to say, what was this about? It was about they wanted to spy on people who didn't support the government. It's as simple as that, if you look at it, the basic thing. And the state was used time and time again, not just with the SDS, but also with Special Branch and with MI5 and with all the different agencies of the state to ensure that they wanted to weaken the left, they wanted to stop the left, and they were absolutely determined to use every means that they had in their power to do so. And therefore, we had a mixture, if you think in the 1970s, of quite repressive policing, which increased as the 70s went on and perhaps reached its height in the 70s at the time of, well, there was the murder of Kevin Gately in 1974 at the Red Lion Square demonstration, which I was on. There was the murder of Blair Peach by the police in 1979 in Southall. This was a very, very high level of state repression. And even now, when I look at the photos of Southall, and you see the relatively small number of fascists surrounded by a phalanx of police and thousands of demonstrators protesting against the fascists being there. This was a deliberate attempt to protect the fascists against the left, against the local communities, against the people who were trying to destroy fascism, and which should have been in all the talk we get is that the Nazis are the baddies, as Dave Smith put it in the recent press conference, and yet these were people who were being protected and being protected all the time. Now, it's also clear from admitting that the argument that was put by the SDS for not infiltrating the fascists, and they didn't do so at all, was that it would have been too dangerous for them. So it's okay for the Asian community in Brick Lane to have an effective pogrom happen to them in 1978. It's okay for people to be murdered on the streets, as Altaf Ali was was murdered. It's okay for the Southall youth to be attacked by the police, but we can't expect the police to go and infiltrate the fascists. So, you know, it strikes you as something, if they were really that dangerous, maybe that should have been something the police were more concerned about. But of course, there's another element with this, and this comes back time and time again. The attitudes within the police force, and particularly within the Metropolitan Police, many of them were sympathetic to the fascists at the time. And we know from the present day that we're now getting regular reports, homophobia, misogyny, racism, time and time again. It's something that I think all of us who are campaigners recognise and know that it's a fact, but this is coming out more and more and more. So I think this is a very important thing. I think the scale of the spying is quite shocking, certainly for myself as a socialist. We were totally open about our campaigning and organisation. We were totally prepared to discuss and debate all these sorts of things. It wasn't a subversive, hidden organisation. It wasn't a secret society, and yet it was too much for the British state. If you look at the issue of Blair Peach, and Suresh has referred to him, they spied on the funeral when thousands and thousands of people went from Southall and brought the body across to East London, where he was buried. Demonstration I was on a year later, they spied on the people who were there on a memorial march. Now, Blair Peach was a friend and a comrade and a neighbour of mine, and so were many of the people who were on the memorial marches. They knew him, many of them personally, and they were there not just as an act of solidarity, but as an act of personal mourning. And yet these people were so cynical that they were able to spy. And that they had a list of, I think, well over 100 names of people on that demonstration, including the information that nearly all of them had special branch files. Now, it seems to me another important thing we should be talking about is, people have raised the question of why it continued. I think there's also the question of the political complexion of why it continued. It was set up under a Labour government. There was a Tory government in the early 1970s which tried to repress the unions and failed, and was thrown out of office effectively by working class militancy. And then you had another Labour government until Thatcher got elected in 79. The Labour government all the way through were involved in this process. And we've heard about the connections with Northern Ireland. We've heard about, we should remember that the hunger strikers who died under Thatcher's rule were also denied political status under the previous Labour government. So you had successive governments that were prepared to protect their power, their organisation and their state against left-wing campaigners in an absolutely open way. So I think those are all big questions for us. I think there's also the question of why, if you are an activist, this makes you subversive. If you think of how laws have changed in this country, if you think of how attitudes have changed in this country, nearly always it has been through activists and campaigners coming together to fight over an injustice or over a whole number of injustices. And actually, over a period of time, they begin to win the argument, and there begins to be a change of law and a change of attitude. We've seen this, for example, with gay rights and with lesbian rights and so on. So all these things, these were people who were doing something not only that was perfectly legitimate for them to do, but actually was something which any person who wants to see the world improved should be doing. It shouldn't be something that's grounds for secret files and repression and all the other things we've seen. It should be grounds for actually congratulation of the people who are keeping going after all these years and who are continuing to campaign. And I think one of the important things that we've done in this campaign is to actually shine a light on that. I don't think for most of us on the left, we were particularly surprised that people spied on us, but I think the nature of it, why it continues to go on and what it's for is very important. And one of the other things it's for, of course, is to intimidate people. The two of the main spies that I knew in the SWP were people who held roles. One of them was treasurer of the Right to Work campaign, which meant he had access to all sorts of names of people, access to the unions they were in. also somebody who worked in the finance office, the socialist worker distribution. So they get names, they get details of people. That's what they want, and they pass them on. And these are the people who get blacklisted from their jobs. These are the people who can't get a job when they want to do it. This is the kind of thing that we're seeing. Now, just to conclude, I think it's worth saying that we've had this very, very lengthy inquiry. I very much agree with many of the points have been made about the failure to address the central political questions here about why it happens, what's wrong with people campaigning for left-wing ideas. I mean, when you even get the possibility of a left-wing Labour leader, the whole of the establishment and the media and the state all bear down against the possibility of that happening. So I think there's big questions there. I'd also like to raise the question of disbanding the Metropolitan Police. I mean, the truth is that this is a police force which is not fit for purpose. It's not fit for purpose. It wasn't fit for purpose in the 70s when it protected the fascists, and it's not fit for purpose today. And I think these are the kind of questions we should be talking about, not just simply having this lengthy thing where time after time we get a bit of information, where we get tiny bits of information, but we don't get the whole picture. We don't get what people are doing. And when people now say, oh, yes, we're against racism, we're for diversity, all the other things that people, the establishment, businesses, universities, public bodies all talk about now, they never say we've got to this position, however inadequate it is, because of what people did in those years, because of them standing up to the fascists, because of them fighting for equal rights for Black and Asian people and for women. We're never told this, and I think it's very important we do put it in the political context. So that's really the main things I wanted to say. Just one very final point I'll make is just to echo what Donna said. The way in which the police were interviewed, the way in which their evidence was heard at the inquiry was completely different from the way that my evidence was heard and that other people were heard. I mean, it was regarded, obviously, there must be something kind of prima facie wrong with a person who joins a socialist organisation and campaigns over a whole range of issues. My view is there should be something wrong with people who don't want to do that kind of thing. And I think for an inquiry to treat the police as though they did nothing wrong, when we know, even already, we know of many of the things they did, which are totally unacceptable, then I think we should be asking very, very serious questions about the conduct of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Lindsey. Brilliant. Okay, as I said, we do want to have time for discussion. So let's keep going for another 15 minutes, if that's okay. So please put your questions in the chat and we can put them to our amazing speakers. Just before we start, just to say that we'll put the link in the chat again, but please do have a look at our report, the PELC report, on our opening statements and closing statement of the UCPI to get a bit more of the detail of some of which has been covered tonight and some of the findings that we've had. Louise has just popped the link again in the chat. The other thing as well is a little shout out to Public Interest Law Centre. If you want to be kept up to date on the work that we're doing at the UCPI, but equally all the other work that we do, you can sign up to get a newsletter and to be kept aware of the events that we hold. And we hold various events throughout the year. So a little shout out to PELC. Okay, just to kick us off, I mean, I've got a question. I'm going to be, we've got a question here. Yeah, I mean, it's the obvious one. Do we still think there's undercover policing happening now? I suppose that's one of the key things is this report is, this inquiry is looking at what's happened historically, but as campaigners, as activists, as lawyers, as academics all together, are these things actually happening now? And how can we look to the lessons of the past now? There's also another question, and then I'll come to the speakers. Yeah, I mean, again, another key question about, how can people support poor participants to the inquiry? And I suppose, how can people who don't have that active role in the inquiry have some agency over the inquiry and over that narrative that's been brought up by some of the speakers this evening? Do any of our lovely speakers want to come back on those questions? Donna, Suresh, Lindsey, please let me know.
Well, I think the answer to question one is obviously yes. I mean, you know, I don't think there can be any doubt that this is going on at all sorts of levels. We've got, you know, the idea they're not. Well, look at the guy who organised the demonstration at the coronation. You know, they get hauled off for 11 hours or whatever it was until all the press have gone home. The idea these people aren't being spied on, I think, is rubbish. I mean, I think the main support for the participants, just from my point of view, is just that we get it as widely known as possible, because it's like with all these things, kind of unity is strength. You know, once people know this is going on, and that but obviously individuals have different concerns and different needs and so on, but I just think it's important to get that out there, really, that there was a bit of coverage on the day that the interim report came out, but pretty feeble after that, really, given it was quite an important thing. But of course, it didn't attract the attention of very many of the media, perhaps not surprisingly.
And just to pick up on what's been said as well about the call for disclosure and the fact that actually there's certainly not been enough disclosure. Donna, you talked about the fact we haven't got our files yet.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know if any of the speakers or indeed anyone else knows about the push to get that disclosure, possibly outside of the inquiry. Has there been any protests? Has there been anything external, I suppose, to the inquiry to kind of push for that disclosure, to push for files?
Well, I think it's always been one of the key demands, and it's been, you know, since I got involved, which was back in 2015, as soon as I found out, it was one of the things that we were pushing for. So the findings of institutional sexism, racism, and also corruption, which pretty much has been found in the Casey review anyway. But in terms of the files, I mean, if you think of the ludicrous situation whereby I will get some redacted form of a file before I'm due to give evidence, but all that information's there already. You know, why shouldn't I have that information now? Why shouldn't I be prepared? And as everyone knows who's been following the inquiry to date, the information is quite shocking and traumatic at times. I mean, the way that women are discussed in particular, people are discussed in terms of how they look, you know, their body size, their weight, their contraception, whether they've had an abortion, their sexuality. And it would actually be nice to have a bit of a lead into that, not just to be presented with this whole chunk of information that you've got to process both politically and personally. And then you've got to give evidence to, you know, to the chair and the lawyers, and really kind of prepare yourself for that as well. I think we're at a bit of a disadvantage in terms of the bias constantly, because the officers involved, even the ones who have left and retired, which is most of them, have had all that information. They've been given it. We don't. We haven't got it. So I think that needs to really go out there. And if it's one kind of call to arms, it would be please support us to get that disclosure.
That's brilliant, Donna. Thanks very much. Also, I can see in the chat, Lisa is kindly putting links to organisations who are covering the inquiry, and really amazing places to get updates. The monitoring group, police spies, out of lives. Yes, I always say that wrong because of my Scottish accent. Anyway, diversion. Campaign opposing police surveillance. And undercover research. So, you know, everyone get hold of those links, because I'm sure you'll be kept up to date with those. If we have no final questions, and because everyone has no doubt had a long day and everyone wants a cup of tea, I would invite the speakers to make a wee closing statement if they wish, no pressure. And then, you know, we'll say goodbye and we'll keep going. So I don't know, Suresh, if you have any closing statements.
Yeah, I think just on, I think the first thing is in terms of, is there undercover policing now? Meeting asked that question, funnily enough, from police officer inquiry, and he was told that they can either confirm or deny, which tells you exactly where we are. It's the elephant in the room. And I think that demand has to be really vocal by us, and there has to be a guarantee given by the police while this inquiry is going on, that there is no such organization like the SDS or police spying on peaceful protest groups, which is legitimate. I think it's a point of red line for me, and I think we need to make sure that happens. Problem in terms of supporting the core participants is this. I mean, I started my contribution by saying really enthusiastic about it because of the experience in other public inquiries. I was the coordinator for the Stephen Lawrence family campaign. And the way that inquiry was conducted by activists and campaigners is very different from now. And we hampered not because of our willingness or lack of strategy, it's because post-COVID, Meeting has used that process to have it on social online stuff and restricted people coming to public galleries and having it a more open, transparent process. So for me, the inquiry is not about where it reaches, it's actually the process of bringing people together and seeking the answers that we want in a way that we want, in a collective way. So even if we have different demands, we need to support them, but actually bring those demands into the well of the inquiry itself. So Meeting cannot escape the lived experience and impact of spying on individuals and communities who face him when they're giving evidence in that way. And I think we need to somehow force that process on Meeting. And when we first started, I think whoever was involved, I know Paul was there and other people were there, Lisa was there, we actually walked out of the inquiry as core participants, warning Meeting that if that wasn't we didn't have an open process, we didn't have disclosure, and if he didn't understand the issue of misogyny and racism, we didn't believe that he could be a person without an advisor, for example, a person who could forensically examine the issues that we needed to in an impartial way. And I think he's demonstrated that he's not capable of even looking or examining or locating the indicators of misogyny or institutional racism, and never mind pass judgment on. He doesn't know how to ask questions. I looked at the evidence in the first part. There's not a single question he asks, and neither does the inquiry solicitor, on finding out whether the police officers, the spies, or undercover officers acted in such manner that it could be racist or misogynist. Not a single question. I'm not saying you ask direct questions, but by the way that they make decisions, etc., so the processes. And I think the only way to do that is actually reignite a collective bringing together of co-participants and a wider public and see how we can foster a more open, transparent process in the next 2 years.
Thank you, Suresh. Really important words. I'll come to you, Donna, if you have any final comments, and Lindsey. So yeah, Donna, if you have any final comments, please go ahead.
I think just agreeing with everything that Suresh said there, and also adding that we, in terms of scale, we have an interim report based on hearings that we are aware of. There's a whole other, secret chapter of hearings that have been held that we know nothing about. We don't know who the officers are. We don't know the scale. We don't know how many sexual relationships. We don't know the more, the miscarriages of justice. So whilst we have this information, we're still having so much withheld. And we know that what we know already is the tip of the iceberg, but we have to just keep shaking the tree and bits fall off and we put it together. And if we work together, that's what we're going to keep doing for the next 3 years and get to some kind of conclusion. But thanks so much for having me. It's been fantastic to talk. Cheers.
Thank you, Donna. And before I come to you, Lindsey, again, I mean, there's some really interesting discussion happening in the chat. From Nyla, who's saying why the identities of undercover officers continuously being protected, and what efforts can be made to expose their identities, and also talking about a campaign that Cage is involved in. Sorry, my scrolling ability has gone very ropey. About the Birmingham Four, who, for anyone that doesn't know about the Birmingham Four, please go and look that up. Maybe you can look that up on Cage's website. But yeah, they were set up by undercover officers in Birmingham. Very similar to the Birmingham 6 process. So there's a lot of international historical importance to what's happening here. And Aisha/Hannah, again, are talking about the kind of racist imperialist British state and the context that this political policing is happening in, and political policing that is focused on left-wing groups, and that's been talked about as well this evening, that it's certainly not equality when it comes to politics. It's very much geared and directed at left-wing politics. All right, Lindsey, over to you for the last few words, if that's all right.
Just to answer one of the questions, which is that, you know, why are the police identities hidden? I mean, it's an incredible thing. I think they claim it's because they wouldn't be safe. But actually, one of the main ones that I knew is no longer alive. So there's absolutely no justification for not giving his name, and that you only have to assume that there's a natural prejudice, if you like, in favour of the police. That's that they must be telling the truth, that they must be under threat. I mean, why wouldn't our identities also be threatened if there's any threatening around? There's plenty of people who don't like what some of the things that we've all said tonight, and so it's a very bogus argument. I'd just like to say thanks to everybody for it's been a really good discussion. I'd just like to echo Ollie New's point that he's made in the chat, which is that it shows that they're frightened of activists. They don't like people doing things. We should be very proud of what we've done collectively as a series of activists, and we should be determined to continue to do it. And that's what they want to stop people doing. So it's very important that we continue to be active. It's important we support the newer generations of people who are no doubt being spied on in the way that we were and still are. I mean, I've got another 2 tranches, I think, going, maybe probably more. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous, really. And for what purpose? What have they learnt about me over the last 50 years that has been of much benefit to anybody, to tell the truth? It's absolutely ridiculous. But there's an important point here, which is that they want you to, and look, the point of these inquiries as well, they go on for years. That's the point of them. They go on for years. It's kicked into the long grass. Look at Bloody Sunday in Ireland, how many years it took them to get any sort of justice at all. But it is worth doing. And I'd just like to pay credit to the people who do so much work around this. I think it's a fantastically important thing to do. And we need to be very sharp on how we try to focus it in the next tranche and how we begin to take it forward, because that's the miners' strike. It's all sorts of other things that we're going to find out about. And that will be pretty hair-raising, I think. So thanks again. Thanks for inviting me. And thanks to all the other speakers. That's been really good.
Excellent last words. And also from...
Well, thank you for you chairing the meeting.
Oh, there we go. No, brilliant. Thank you so much. I've got, when all I can see is myself. So when I heard noise, I was like, oh, I don't know what it is. Anyway, it's been an amazing, hopefully an amazing meeting. I know the speakers have been amazing. And thanks to Zachary in the chat, who says, I'm new to Zoom, and this is the first time on a chat like this and you've enjoyed it. So I think that's high praise, probably to the speakers. All right, okay, there's lots to do. The inquiry continues, so please download our report, keep your eyes on what's happening with the inquiry. There's room for everyone to get involved. And yeah, thanks again to all the speakers and everyone that came tonight. So thank you. Recording will be up in a few weeks. Good night, everyone.